Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Moulthun. So I'm regular basically in this channel. If you don't know much about me, today is basically my plan is to show you three games, and the whole idea is to go through some games which have a bit more sentimental value to myself, for whichever reasons, not just because I played strong players or anything like that, but more because of the reason behind each game. So the first game I've chosen for you is one I played against Adrian Florian in the World Open of 2006. And this game, it was sort of like my first international open. So I started chess when I was 11, and at this point in time I was about 14, 15ish. And I'd been playing mostly online up until this point, and I really wanted sort of a big tournament to play in, or some sort of open. I really enjoy playing open tournaments because I get a chance to play players who you would normally not get to play, stronger opponents usually in the first few rounds. And so after some convincing, I finally managed to get my dad to take me to this tournament because they had huge rating prizes, and I thought that I was a little bit underrated. I was 2180 at the time. I thought I was probably good enough to win the under 2300 or so prize. And after some convincing, yeah, I managed to go. And when I got there, this was the final round of the tournament, and I think it started about 7 p.m. and it went on till past midnight. So it's one of the longest games I ever played, and I managed to snatch a win. But well, we'll play through the game, and I'll get to the point where it was relevant for me. The opening wasn't that interesting, but I'll just skip through quickly. Okay, so the opening was like a Sicilian Najdorf. I haven't really managed to get anything from this at all. But we reached some position like this where I didn't really feel like I had too many winning chances here because my opponent has basically blocked off most of my opening tries, and his pawn structure is very good. His knights are also very strong here. They sort of controlled a lot of key squares. But I think the difference for me back then was I didn't really care so much about the result. I mean, at this point in time, the result was never running through my head. I didn't even know if I would get anything if I won this game. I was really just playing for the love of the game. And the most important thing, I think, I was really fighting every single game back then. So I didn't know how, but I was going to try and work out a way to slowly make progress, put pressure on my opponent, and maybe try and get some point from this position. So I maneuvered my pieces around. So I played queen d2, maneuvered my knight around, and slowly came up with this plan of playing b4. And my idea was to stop this knight from coming to c5 and maybe swing my queen across to the c4 square. Yeah, so I slowly just brought my pieces in, pushed my queenside pawns, and step by step I was making a little bit more progress. Bishop b3, queen d3. Now I was attacking the pawn on d6, so he moved his king to defend it. And here I played a move to sort of take away some of the squares from his pieces. And I think it was a key moment in this particular game because after I played this move, I could feel that I had a little bit more chances. And this is an idea which is common in a lot of positions such as Benoni's, where you sort of sacrifice a pawn in order to free up some pieces. So here I played the move pawn to e5. So after the move pawn to e5, he captured, but now he can't make use of this e5 square anymore for his knights. So that's already some sort of bonus for me. I also played h4 here to stop any sort of kingside attacks. Queen h7, of course I want to keep queens on, so I played queen c4, queen check, king h2, and I slowly making progress on the queen side, sort of keeping his pawn on b7 and a6 locked up, and hopefully bringing the queen into the attack. So bishop a4 is to stop any sort of knight c6s, knight d7 blocking, and my plan is to go queen c7 check. Still not exactly sure how I'm going to win this game, but at least we can see that we're making progress. So queen check, king g7, queen takes e6. So now all of a sudden I have some more squares for my pieces. I have knight f5, my bishop is on this long diagonal, and my queen is on some very active squares. So all of a sudden I feel like there's some decent chances for white. So bishop b3, knight h7, queen f5, knight f6, queen went back to e6, and all of a sudden here, after queen check, my opponent decided that he didn't really want to repeat moves, so he went for this variation. But after king g6, white already has a forced sequence that leads to checkmate here. So in this position, I can just play the move bishop c2 check, e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, and h5 is mate. And this was a nice finish to the game, just not because it was a very long game, but it was probably the game that started everything for me. So it finished late after midnight, and I remember I didn't really check the pairings or anything after that or results. I sort of just went off and played blitz with a group of guys until I think 1 a.m. at night, waiting for the closing ceremony. But I think I realized that there was no closing ceremony in American tournaments, or in this American tournament in particular, which is very different from the Australian tournaments I used to play in. So I wasn't sure what was happening until one of the people I was playing blitz with, I think they mentioned that I'd won a prize, which was the one I was going for when I went there. And more importantly, I think I ended up getting my first IM norm, which was never on my mind at the time, but it started off a chain reaction. And after I got the first one, I basically had to get the next two. I don't think I've ever left the movie theater without the movie being finished. So I basically had to finish it. So this basically kicked off my whole entire chess. So next I'll take you to the next game, which was one I played while I was going for my GM title. So this one was against Dubov. So this tournament was the Qatar Masters. So at this point in time, I'd already had my IM title, and I was going for my GM title. Again, I was never planning to get my GM title either. I sort of got my first norm by accident once again. And so I was going for my second and third norms. So I trained for quite a number of months before I went on a huge trip. And this was the first tournament on my circuit. And it was probably the biggest open I ever played in Qatar, because there was just so many famous players there, and there was a huge cutoff of about 2,300, I believe. So you don't get an easy opponent. So you may as well win, because if you lose, you're not going to get any weaker of an opponent. And I remember starting the tournament off really, really badly. I was on, I think, 1 out of 4. At one point, I think I lost 2 or 3 games in a row, and I was completely demoralized. And I just felt like quitting the tournament. But at the same time, I knew that I'd played well up until that point, and I knew there were people watching this tournament everywhere, and it just didn't feel good being on those bottom boards when I knew I played basically as best as I could. But anyway, I told myself I'd come back. I did manage to win the next 2 games, and then in the game after that, I played Dubov, he's one of my favorite players. Of course, I love Dubov because he has a really interesting playing style, very aggressive, very sharp, and very interesting player to play against. But at the same time, I knew that I was going to get some sort of Sicilian. I mean, he's well known for his classical Sicilian, and I regard him as one of the best players in the classical Sicilian. So the night before, I was contemplating whether I should go into a classical Sicilian, which is one of my opponent's pet lines. But at the same time, I felt that if I was going to deviate, it probably wouldn't end well. So after some thought, I decided I'm just going to go into it anyway and see how it goes. I mean, if it doesn't go well, then it doesn't go well. I get outplayed, so be it. But let's just go for it and then see how it turns out. So We started out, of course, into a classical Sicilian, which is what I expected. So we went straight into one of the main lines, which is the rouser. So bishop g5 here I regard as the most troubling line for black. So my opponent played e6, of course, queen d2, a6 we castle. He developed his bishops. I brought my knight back to f3, b5, and here I played a move which is very common in these structures, and that's the double black's pawns. With bishop takes f6. G takes f6 because he can't take back with the bishop because of the d6 pawn. And then we play f5. So f5 again is a very common move in this structure, trying to stop black's pieces from developing. If black takes the pawn, then we have a lot of compensation with the d5 square and these light square holes around the king. So my opponent played knight to e5. So bishop to d3 was played. h5. King b1, queen b6. So the good thing about black's position is that he has the bishop pair and very solid center, but at the same time he has this problem of where do you put the king, because there's no real safe spot on either the king side or the queen side. So usually the king just hangs around the center for a while. Knight e2. Knight goes to g4. I played knight to d4. My opponent was threatening knight f2. Bishop h6. So Dubov wants to bring the bishop to h6. Pawn takes, and I played h3. Kicking the knight back. And now before moving the knight back to e5, my opponent threw in bishop to h6, probably expecting the retreat of the queen, since the knight is threatening to go to f2 here. The most obvious moves would be queen e2 and queen to e1, but this is probably where I played the first move, which my opponent wasn't expecting. And I didn't initially see it either until I got here. But then I realized queen c3 was quite a strong reply, because there's a lot of tactics here if my opponent goes for the immediate knight to f2. So the idea of queen c3 is that I'm not defending against this fork, but if my opponent does go for this fork, then I have a very interesting sacrifice in this position. So I can play the move knight takes e6 here, and it gets incredibly wild from here, because after knight takes e6, if my opponent then takes the knight, if my opponent takes the rook, then I can also consider throwing in a check on c7 or taking the pawn. But if bishop takes here, then queen takes f6 leads to some very interesting tactics, because I'm hitting the rook now, I'm hitting this bishop on e6. Pretty much the only move for black here is to play king to d7. And after king d7, I have more tactics. So two moves come to mind here. So one is some sort of bishop takes b5, or even bishop c4 here is a very strong move. So totally ignoring the rooks. Instead, we're going for this bishop on e6, creating some sort of dangerous threats here. The idea being that if my opponent then captures, let's say with the bishop or the pawn, then I can follow up with the move knight to e5 check, and the king is just in a bad spot, so I can just keep checking until I either win a lot of material or it's going to lead to checkmate here. After knight c6 check, black has to give up the queen. So instead, b4 was played. So I was a little bit surprised about this move. I couldn't work out the idea right away, but once I did work out the idea, it sort of became a lot easier to prepare my moves after that. So I played queen b3, which is the most obvious retreat here. There's no point coming back to e1. Instead, I'm just going to sacrifice the exchange. So after knight e3, I went for knight takes e6. So I'm happy just to sacrifice here. If it takes the rook, then I'll just take back. And the fact that these light squares are so weak, I have a lot of compensation here as white, and the attack continues. So after rook b8, my opponent's plan here is he's setting up to go for some sort of queen trap. So the idea is that after b4, the knight on e3 is actually not going to move, but instead it's just taking away these key squares from the queen, and black will just push this pawn up the board and then trap my queen with a5, a4, which is a very clever idea. So once I spotted this idea, that's when I found this move knight to d4. And after the move pawn to a5, my idea was to counter this a4 move with some sort of attack against this king. So I played the move bishop to b5 here. So we're stopping a4, but we're putting a bishop on pre. But you'll see that if the bishop gets taken, then we get some dangerous mating threats against the king, because the king is just stuck in the center here. The queen will sort of jump into this e6 square. At the same time, black still can't take this rook because there's just too many threats. I mean, I can even play queen to e6 check here. You see the black king is in a really bad spot. So I can just take on f6 or take the bishop next move. So bishop takes b5 was played, and here I needed to be a little bit accurate, so I spent a lot of time finally coming to terms with queen e6, king d8. If king f8, I think the attack continues again with queen takes pawn, and the knight will enter in the game into f5 or e6 or so on later on. So the king went to d8, and here I played the move knight takes b5, knight takes d1, and white has a few options here, but you want to be as accurate as you possibly can. So I went for queen takes f6 check. So the king has to stay on the second rank, because if it stays on the back rank, then I'll take the rook. So it has to come to this square. It's the only square left. And here I'm running out of pieces, so you need to be careful which move you choose. Rook takes d1 I was contemplating on as well, which is probably also winning, but I thought that it might allow black some chances because I didn't see it leading to any checkmates after takes here. And the worst thing that can happen here is that you run out of checks, the king escapes, and we just throw whole rook down. So instead of taking the knight here, I played a different move. So I played another check in between. So I played knight e5 check. So again, the idea is that we want to force the king to the back rank, because if the king goes anywhere back here, we always have queen takes rook with check, which is very important. Whereas now the king can't come forwards, and it basically is forced to take, after which we can take the knight, but it comes with a check. So pawn takes, and then rook takes knight comes with a check. So in this position, black is forced to go back to the back rank, in which case we can just capture the rook. So king to c8, queen takes rook. And here my opponent resigned, because after king to b7, white has a number of ways to pick up the bishop. The easiest one probably just being queen check, followed by some sort of discovery after knight c7 check. Should be winning here for white. For example, let's say something like this, followed by maybe check. And when the king comes back, we can either check on d5 or let's say check on e6, followed by taking the bishop. Should be good enough. So yeah, I went into this tournament wanting to play solid chess, but I ended up getting all decisive results, either wins or losses throughout the whole tournament. and this was probably my most memorable game. So I ended up playing um, one of the best tournaments in my chess career, after probably one of the worst starts I've ever had. So yeah, it was a memorable tournament for me. And the final game I want to show you is one which will always sort of stick out to me as probably um, one of my favorite games. Not only because the game started out as a King's Gambit, but also it also was in one of my favorite tournaments against a player I'd struggled to play against in the past. I'd lost to him at least once or twice in the past, but we'd always have some very interesting attacking games regardless. And this was also in the final round where I needed to win to get my IM norm. And I'd played in this tournament a year earlier in the final round as well, and I got a King's Gambit and went on to lose that game in a very sort of tragic way. I was sort of doing very, very well and then ended up playing the wrong rook sacrifice at the very end and then losing that game. And that basically cost me my chance of getting the Brilliancy Prize for that particular event. And that was very discouraging because that was one of the last chances I got to play chess, because I was in the final years of my schooling. So I stopped for at least a year after that game. And I remember the judge for the Brilliancy Prize telling me that if I had found that correct rook sacrifice, I definitely would have gotten that Brilliancy Prize, which is not necessarily important, but it's a nice thing to know. That was also a King's Gambit, and this one also started out as a King's Gambit. So once again, we get basically a repeat of what happened a year ago before this game in the exact last round. So the King's Gambit was the first opening I learned, and one of my favorite openings to date still. So it has a lot of sentimental value for me. So in the most important game, of course, I'm going to choose this opening if I have the chance to play it, especially knowing that my opponent is going to play bishop c5, which is going to lead some very interesting positions. So after d6, I went for c3. So my idea is to play d4 here and so block the bishop because it's stopping my king from casting here. So knight f6 was played. Here d4 is probably the most popular move for white, but I opted for a different line, something which I thought led to a little bit sharper play. So after pawn takes e5 instead, pawn takes, I went knight takes e5. My opponent played my opponent castled, sorry. And after d4, instead of moving the bishop back, he played the move knight takes e4. Very nice move and leads to some very sharp tactics, because the idea is I can't take the bishop just yet because there's some sort of queen trade, or queen h4 might also be a possibility, followed by a knight check here. And my opponent's just going to pick up the rook in the corner. So I have to watch out for black's tactics. So there is a game in this position which I believe continued queen d3, played by Bronstein, I believe, where his opponent played queen h4 check. And this was the only game I was aware of at the time, which continued something like this. And I think the players played this, king check, and then white played bishop h6 with a very big attack, and then went on to win a very nice game here. So this was the main game I was following, but of course my opponent wasn't going to play queen h4 check because I think it was a mistake. So instead my opponent played bishop to f5, which is a very interesting move, just putting more pressure on me. I still can't take this bishop because I think my opponent's just going to sacrifice it. He can always just move the queen somewhere. This knight's going to have a lot of trouble, because if I move my knight, there's going to be lots of discoveries along this e-file. So this is a possible move that my opponent could have played. Queen h4 again is some ideas in this position. So I want to be careful of that. So instead I played queen to f3 after a long think. And you have to remember, these were very long games. These were 90 minutes at least, plus some I think either 30-second or 1 minute increment, because Gibraltar has very long time controls. I believe it's one of the only tournaments which has 2 or 3 time controls with added time after like move 40 and so on. So in this position, I think my opponent had already spent almost all his time completely, and there were a bunch of spectators watching this game because it was very unusual to be on only move 9 and your opponent's left through about 7 minutes left on the clock. So he spent nearly a good 1 hour and a half thinking about what to do, and I'm assuming he spent most of his time looking at moves such as bishop takes d4, sacrifices, and there's all sorts of ideas here for black he needs to consider. He went for g6, just sort of keeping the tension. And again, I think it's too dangerous to take this bishop on c5, so I opted for the move bishop to c4 instead. So after bishop c4, I'm threatening maybe some ideas of sacrificing myself on f7, followed by maybe some g4 ideas. The main idea I want to play here is g4. So I want to play g4, kick the bishop out, and then capture this knight on e4. Bishop d6. So of course I went g4 here, which is the most critical move. I can castle, but I think that allows black an easy game. After g4, he has to make a decision because this bishop is hanging. He went queen check, king f1, bishop takes knight, and I took this bishop on f5. The knight dropped back. Bishop drops back to b3. Bishop back. So we exchanged here, and then I need to develop the rest of my pieces on the queen side, so I played rook g1 first. So the threat is to go rook takes on g6. My opponent just ignored it, so we didn't even worry about defending this pawn. And this is one thing you can do that you'll notice attacking players don't usually defend. They sort of always look for any opportunity they can to go for some sort of counterplay on the opposite side instead. So here I played the move bishop to e3 to stop the rook coming into the e1 square. Probably I could have played bishop to f4 here, because the rook check isn't too bad after king e2. But in the game it looked worse than it probably is, because there's no checks here for black anymore. Even after the exchanges, I think it's totally fine, and we maintain our bishop pair here with a decent position. So instead bishop e3 was played. The king went to f8. I think that's to sidestep this rook idea. Again, there's this constant tactics in this position, so I can't take on g6, because even though there's a pin here, my opponent has a counter sacrifice on e3, and here I just lose the rook, because after queen takes, pawn takes rook, it's just good for black. So I play bishop f2. So just to point out, you can't take the pawn because rook h1 here would trap the queen. So queen h6 instead, and I play knight a3. So after knight a3, the idea is to play knight b5 and attack this knight, so dislodge it from the square, and then go queen takes f7 on knight b5, instead of taking the knight or defending the c7 pawn, which was what I was actually expecting. Here I actually thought I had a very strong attack, and I didn't see how I was not going to win some material at least. Instead, my opponent just sacrificed the material, which was a little bit surprising to me at the time, but once I saw the move, I sort of realized that it was very, very strong. So after knight c7, rook e4 is what my opponent played. So instead of defending the rooks, he just said, okay, you can take the rook on a8. Instead, I'm just going to bring my rook into e4 and swing across to f4 and go for your king instead. So I play bishop g3, attacking this knight, stopping rook f4. And then knight to f5. Knight takes rook. Knight e3 check. king to e2. I spent a long time here because I wasn't sure which square to go to, and it turns out that king f2 is totally fine for me, because if black is going to give a check here, then the rook on e4 is going to be undefended here. So if there's a check, I can sort of just move my king up, I think, and it should be totally fine. After this, the queen check shouldn't lead to anything after king goes across. So instead I went king e2, I think. Wait, I think I accidentally override the game. Sorry, just give me a sec. So I just need to repaste that. Okay, so we're back in this position here. So after knight takes rook, check, king e2, knight went to c4, and I decided to just give up the queen here because black's attack was getting a bit too strong. And after queen check, the king went back. My opponent played knight takes queen, and then bishop takes knight on c4, and we get some very interesting material imbalance here. So I'm a whole queen down for a couple of pieces, but the most important thing in this position is that my knight is sort of stuck on a8 and it can't really get back into the game. So my opponent's going to make use of this by playing queen takes b2. So again, it's threatening knight d2 check. Rook went to d1, knight check, rook takes, queen takes, and everything depends on whether I can get this knight back into the game on c7. If I can, then white should have close to winning position. If I can't, then black should be more than fine. So bishop check was played, the king went across, and then I played the move rook to g3. So the idea is to defend this c3 pawn, but also to defend this h2 pawn, because if queen takes h2, one of my ideas was to play bishop takes f7, and after king takes f7, I have rook to f3, opening a discovered attack along here against the queen on h2. Instead, my opponent played b5, so he's trying to distract me from this a2 pawn. So if I take it, then there's going to be some queen takes a2, or perhaps even some forks. I think maybe some forking ideas with queen check and queen check is possible. Or maybe he just wants to take the pawn first, followed by queen check here. So when bishop b3, b4 is played. So bishop takes, now the queen can capture the h2 pawn. So now I have to watch out for constant forks and ideas by black to win some pieces. So after there, this stops queen check, because then that would fork the knight. So king goes across, and here I thought there's no way for black to defend this pawn on f7, but once again my opponent finds constant tactics, and he plays the move bishop to f6, which was not what I saw at all. And I thought it was a brilliant move because if rook takes now, then the idea is queen h4 would fork the rook. At the same time, the knight is still stuck, so I can't get out. So I play bishop d5, defending everything along the diagonals. And now the plan is to swing the king into the game. I think there was a point in time during this game where black missed a very forcing way to pick up a piece, but we were both in severe time trouble at this point in the game. We're just playing off basically 10-second increments. So started pushing the g pawn. So this is probably the one thing I need to watch out for, because this is the only winning try black has to push these kingside pawns. King goes up. And black keeps pushing the pawn to g3. At this point in the game, it got a little bit scary because it's very hard to see how you're going to stop this pawn. So I put my rook on e2, just covering this light square, so hopefully that black is not able to get past this fortress. Queen g4, rook g2, and bishop d8. So some very accurate moves from my opponent as well. The idea is if I play knight c7 here, then there's queen f4. So just picking up that knight. So play bishop to d5. So the idea here is to go king c6 perhaps at some point, and then bishop d6, and then maybe try to swing the knight into the game. King goes across. So this takes away a lot of squares from my king. I still can't go king c6 just yet because of queen c8 check, so I need to work out a way to get that in. So just move my rook around for now. Threatening rook check, and then picking up f7 perhaps. Queen f5. So at this point in the game, I'm just running out of moves entirely. And now my opponent is threatening to perhaps bring the queen to f2. And look at pushing that pawn up the board. There's just really no moves here for white. So I decided maybe it's time to just take the pawn because I didn't see a better move. And my idea was that after queen check, that I would go king to d7. So this was the whole point. And I saw that if queen takes rook, I would go king takes bishop. And here there'd be no way for black to stop me from escaping the knight to c7. And I should be winning here with the 3 pieces versus queen. But of course my opponent didn't play that. He played a different move, which I wasn't expecting either, which was queen f5 check, just coming back to the original square. So initially I thought this was just going to be the same position where I'm a pawn up, but I realized, yeah, I don't really have any moves here. I don't think I can go king c6 either because of some queen c8 check perhaps, which is just going to lead to some favorable checks for black. So I think this one, yeah, so my king has to go to d6 or b5. That was the problem. And then queen b8 check. This is a problem playing against the queen. There's just constant checks everywhere. And now black picks up the rook. And if king d6, there's queen b8, of course, again, skewering the rook. So this is the problem. So I didn't really have a choice here but to go king back to d6. And my opponent just took a perpetual because without the g-pawn, there's not much winning tries for black. So queen check, and we both just agreed to a draw here. But this ended up winning actually a shared brilliancy prize, which is very rare for tournaments because the game ended up in a draw. So this is one of my most more memorable games for a number of reasons I mentioned earlier, and probably one of my favorite games as well. So yeah, so that basically concludes this lecture for um, the three games I wanted to show. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to sort of type through in the chat, and I'm happy to sort of answer any questions for the time we have remaining.